Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this evening. My name is Chris Entz. I'm a CFP and member of the support team here at Advice, and thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're going to be diving into the wild and wonderful world of retirement spending and really talking about what it is to create a good spending targets, how we stress test on the platform, and how you can start playing around with different spending amounts. How can we stress test your retirement plan with more or less, build guardrails, really everything we can think of, kind of look at in the spending side. We're going to be diving into a case study that looks at those things, and we can be taking your questions as we go. So if this is your first time with us, please use the Q&A tab to ask questions as they come to you. You can use the chat as well, but I'd prefer if you use the Q&A tab so I don't miss it. So send your questions in as we go. We want to make these sessions as useful as possible. And without further ado, I'm going to kick things over to Owen to start us off.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so welcome everybody. My name's Owen. I'm an advice-only financial planner, a CFP, and the founder of Advice. And as Chris mentioned, in today's session, we're going to be going through some content around retirement spending, success rate, how to think about retirement spending and success rate in terms of your retirement plan, things to look at, things to think about, and also why this is a very complex, sort of retirement planning. It's a very complex challenge, problem to solve. So, we often sort of say accumulation is easy, decumulation is hard. Part of the reason why decumulation is so hard is there's just so many variables, so many factors, and it varies from person to person. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's talk through a little bit, just in general about retirement planning, and then we're going to get specifically into the case study, and we're going to go through some examples together. We'll talk through the charts, the tables, but in general, why I find retirement planning so interesting, and I do love retirement planning. I find it to be a huge value add when working with clients. One of the things I find so interesting about retirement planning is that there are, of course, multiple different factors at stake. We are trying to balance spending. We always want to try to maximize retirement spending. We want to get the most we can out of retirement spending, especially in early retirement. But we also don't want to run out of money later in retirement. So we're always kind of fighting against one against the other. We're balancing investment risk, inflation rate risk, along with increased spending and getting the most out of the plan. So in tonight's section, we're going to talk a little bit about that. I will kind of highlight that when we go through the platform, it really is spending driven. So we'll talk a little bit about spending first. One of the reasons why we mentioned that is that as you change spending, it will change the drawdown plan. It will change the drawdown that the platform is doing. So it's really all based on your after-tax spending amount. I do feel like this is a more intuitive way to do planning because in the end, that's what we're trying to get at is how much you can spend in early, mid, and late retirement. Now we'll talk through on this session, we'll talk through spending, retirement spending, different phases of retirement spending. We'll talk through after-tax spending. We're also going to talk through just net worth and drawdown, so different drawdown phases, different orders of decumulation. And then we're going to talk a lot about success rate, so sequence of returns risk, how to think about this within your retirement plan. Is there a risk of running out of money? How early would that be within your plan? That's what we want to sort of go over on the call today. So before we get started, anything I'm missing here, Chris?
Nope, let's get started.
Okay, so let's jump in through the case study. So I'm going to start off here in the income section. We're just going to get to know the people that we're working with. So we'll go through income, expenses, and cash flow first. We'll talk a little bit about spending on the platform and how to make some of those changes. So here we've got Dave and Bonnie. So Dave's currently age 50, Bonnie's 49. They want to retire at 56. So actually, if we go here to expenses, so we can see the different phases of retirement spending already. So we've got current spending, age 50 to 55, 49 to 54 for Bonnie. They're going to retire at the same time. So when Dave is 56 and Bonnie's 55, they're planning to spend more in early retirement and a little bit less in late retirement. And we'll talk about how to create those different spending snapshots, phases of retirement spending. Now, the platform is very much spending driven. So the first place that we always want to focus is on the current spending snapshot. So here we want to create a good retirement spending estimate. And the best way to do that is to start with your current spending. So on the platform, you'll see that there's a number of categories that we want to fill out here. That will drive the cash flow diagram. This gives us a good view of the gross income, deductions, net income, and then where all that money is going to currently. And usually we have a fairly good idea. Usually we have a good idea of mortgage payments, property tax payments. We know how much we're setting aside in TFSA contributions or debt payments. But some of these other ones we might not have a very good idea. So one thing that you'll notice the platform will do for you is that, let's say we underestimated some expenses here. Let's say that Bonnie and Dave maybe underestimated their miscellaneous expenses just a little bit. One of the things that the platform will do that you may have noticed is that it will highlight the missing expenses for you. And if you don't correct this, it will carry forward that missing amount into retirement. Part of the reason is we're assuming it's spending both now and retirement. If we can't identify where exactly it's coming from, we're going to assume that that spending continues both now and in the future. So I would always recommend that we clean this up. We put this into a specific category. For Bonnie and Dave here, we don't know exactly where it's going, but we do want to address that amount. And so we're going to increase miscellaneous back up to 500 each. We don't know exactly where it's going, but we do know that there's a certain amount that must be in that personal spending miscellaneous category. And this, quite frankly, is quite common. It's quite common to have 500, 1,000, 2,000 plus in miscellaneous, not unexpected at all. You can certainly itemize it into more detail, but this thing could be like things like gifts or pet expenses or things like that. So definitely very common to have that sort of miscellaneous amount there. That's the first thing to highlight is that in the platform, we want to have a good understanding of your current spending as the starting point for retirement spending. Now, I'll show you a couple of tricks here. So once we have a good idea of your current spending, rather than typing in all of the individual amounts, we can just go up here and make a copy of a financial snapshot. So often this is what I will like to do when I'm creating a retirement plan is I will start with their current spending, make a copy. So let's just call this an example. And we'll say it's 55 to 56. Again, just an example. And here what it's done is it's copied all of the current spending over into this retirement category. And we can have any sort of age range we want. But the nice thing is it gives us a starting point. A lot of these things will remain the same. So maybe not mortgage because they're expecting to pay that off. But property tax in today's dollars, not likely to be very much different. So if there's no plan to sell, move, downsize, upsize, we can just assume the same property tax amount in today's dollars. And all of these are going to be in today's dollars, and the platform will increase by inflation for you. So housing costs, pretty standard to have similar, but there might be some changes that we want to make. So let's remove this, and I'll show you what those changes are in our example here. So for Dave and Bonnie, we have got from some fairly similar spending here in the housing section. So if we go kind of across here by category, we can say that home and tenant insurance, very similar year to year, home repairs, maintenance, very similar year to year. This is a great check. This is why we want to do that bottoms up retirement spending estimate, because we just want to make sure that all of these categories make sense and that we have a fairly similar amount in the different phases. Now, transportation might change. So here for Dave and Bonnie, a lot is the same, but in late retirement, they've reduced their spending on fuel and gas. So maybe they're just not traveling quite as frequently. So again, this is a great way to understand, okay, what's going to change from a lifestyle perspective in each phase of retirement. Some of these things might not just change at all. So we might be doing the same vehicle upgrade in the future. We might not upgrade to a more expensive vehicle. It might just be the same type of vehicle. So that stays the same, but other things might change. Now, some big changes are usually impersonal. So likely not food, cleaning, staples, but things like restaurants might go up. We might spend more time eating out with friends. So here we've increased the restaurant spending, and then it comes back down in late retirement. Vacation travel, another very common category to see go up in mid-retirement as well, early mid-retirement. So here we've got 12,000 a year for vacation travel. And after age 80, it's going to decrease quite a bit. Fairly common in that age 75, 80 to see a reduction there as well. And there might be other things here as well. So maybe in late retirement, we don't have quite as much miscellaneous spending. Maybe we're just not eating out as often or a little kind of frivolous expenses. Maybe there's just not as much there after a certain point. So again, we can reduce that as well. So for Dave and Bonnie, we've got two different spending phases. We've got early retirement, 88,000 a year, and we've got late retirement, about 67,000 a year. Now, you don't have to start with a detailed estimate. You could start with just a fairly basic estimate. So let's go here. Let's add a financial snapshot. So let's add a blank one. Again, we're going to call this the example. We'll go 55 to 56. Again, just as an example. And let's say that we don't have that bottoms up yet. That's fine. We can go down here to miscellaneous. And we're just going to estimate something like $7,000 a month. Good round number, fairly decent estimate. That gives us 84,000 a year, 7,000 a month. So if you want to start at that point, definitely you can do that. I would highly recommend coming back at some point to do that full detailed bottoms up, based on your current spending. And part of the reason is you can already see it here, 7,000 is a fairly good estimate. It's only $370 off of the bottoms up estimate that we did. And yet when you multiply by 12 and we get an annual amount, it's actually $4,400 difference per year. So we think about like something like the 4% rule, that $4,400 requires an extra 100,000 plus in financial assets to support that for the rest of retirement. So even a small, sort of variance in retirement spending can have a huge impact. $100,000, if we miss that on your net worth or on your starting investment balance, that would be a huge discrepancy. And here you can see how quickly and easily it is to get to something similar from a spending perspective. So when we talk about retirement spending, this is why it's so important to have a good retirement spending estimate when you're doing a retirement plan. Anything else here, Chris?
I think just two things that I'd mention in terms of not specific platform things, but one that's going to be a really interesting exercise just as you're going through this transition, if you're looking at retiring shortly, it's a good intention exercise. What do I want retirement to look like? Going through things, what would I like to be higher? What might change? It's a good mental exercise to just kind of start imagining what retirement might look like. The other thing that we often recommend, if you're pre-retirement, but you're just coming up to that amount, and you start imagining a different kind of budget. Now that could be higher or lower. We really recommend you try it out. Do a trial 6-month period where you're trying out a lower amount of spending or maybe a higher amount of spending to say, is this actually what I want? Before I'm pulling the big trigger, and especially we're looking at a case study that's retiring at 55, sometimes you want to test things out a little bit. So that's something we always recommend to pre-retirees to say, if you have an idea what you want, especially if it's different than now, maybe try it
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. Like that trial run of the retirement budget, and especially if it's different than current spending, is a great way to just validate, is that the right number, especially if it's lower. So yeah, that's a great point. Now, the other thing I want to mention here while we're in spending is that, the platform does highlight some categories that sometimes get overlooked. So home repair maintenance, fairly common category to get overlooked over time. It does add up to quite a bit. And the other one would be like vehicle repair replacement. Again, sometimes gets overlooked. Maybe there's a lump sum amount within the plan, but very easy to underestimate some of these expenses. Sometimes we see this add up to 5, 10, 20% of the retirement budget, just because that wasn't included at all. So, making sure that we do the bottoms up estimate also helps to make sure we're not missing categories in the retirement budget. So definitely retirement spending important.
And to be clear in those kind of categories, what we're recommending is a monthly sinking fund contribution. There are multiple ways to do this, but we found with retirement planning that really helps smooth out the risk over the year instead of saying, oh, I'll just pull that from my TFSA when it comes time to replace my car. But you're adding an extra element of risk to your plan. Yes, could that work out? Yes, people do it, but it adds an element of risk that we can avoid by including it as part of your retirement spending and making that a regular amount that you're setting aside and keeping in a cash or cash-like pot.
Yeah, just smoothing things out for sure. Okay, so Dave and Bonnie, 88,000 early retirement, 67,000 late retirement. Let's take a look at their assets to see how they're going to support that. And then we'll get into more detail on their projections. So again, they're 5 years from retirement. So they've got 1.2 million in assets right now. They've got a healthy amount in registered assets. We've got 400, 600, $740,000 here. We've got TFSAs that are maximized, a bit of non-registered assets here as well. We've got their home value, but again, there's no plans to sell or downsize in the future. So that really is just estate value in the future. We do have quite a bit of RSP contribution room. The reason I mention that is we'll see when we start optimizing the plan, we'll see why we might want to change the order of accumulation to take advantage of that. Okay, so we've got assets. Now, Dave and Bonnie do have a mortgage remaining. So here around $100,000, 4.5% interest, $2,000 a month. It's important to highlight that the platform will take this payment amount from the debt section, not necessarily what you entered into expenses. Sometimes in expenses, you might have things like, could be insurance, mortgage insurance or something like that in that mortgage amount. This really is just the debt payment amount. And the platform will use this to predict when the debt gets paid off. We can also add a renewal date here if the interest rate is going to go up or down in the future, but not necessarily do you need to use that? You can leave that out. Okay, so we've got 100,000 in mortgage, 1.2 million in assets. We'll kind of skip over these phases here. Let's go down to investment plan. So here, Dave and Bonnie have a kind of low-cost portfolio manager, 1% fees, and a balanced or sort of maybe aggressive, assertive asset allocation. So 75% equities, 25% fixed income, and they've got a fairly reasonable 4.88% return assumption. So that's the base return assumption that we'll be using in the projection. And then the other thing to highlight here in the foundation is the CPP and old age security estimate. Now, as a base, Bonnie and Dave are planning to start at age 65. So we've got 15,000 here for Dave. And the platform is doing a dynamic estimate. So it is including future earning assumptions, CPP enhancement, but it's also including the fact that Dave's going to stop working at 56 and not have any contributions between 56 and 65. So a bit of a drag there for Dave, but CPP enhancement does help offset that a little bit over the next few years. Full old age security, again, this is all in today's dollars, so that'll go up with inflation. Bonnie's a little bit less for CPP, but it's important to highlight that at age 65, they're going to have about $45,000 between these four government benefits. And that, again, highlights one of the challenges with retirement planning, spending, success rate, is that this income only phases in at age 65 for Dave and Bonnie. And we've got between age, 55, 56, and 65 to bridge with the financial assets. So we'll see it in the plan. There's more withdrawals happening in that early part of retirement. I think that's all we want to highlight here in the setup. Chris, any other pieces we need to go over?
The only thing that you can mention as another area that can pull into the spending data is in the debt payoff plan tab. So we don't have a
Yeah.
lot of debt to really worry about here. We've got a small mortgage that's still being paid off. But if you have debt and you're paying off debt, you can enter in a lump sum, either general that's going to decide where to put it in terms of highest interest first, or you can make it a really specific payment here, and that's going to pull into your spending as well. So just to kind of highlight, that's another area that you can play around with spending.
Yeah, that's a great point. So yeah, if you want to get very specific with debt payoff, you can plan lump sum payments year by year, even month by month. And if you have multiple debts, you can just put it here and let the platform decide where to apply those extra lump sums. But here for Dave and Bonnie, we're not going to maximize the debt payoff. We're going to be focused on RSP and TFSA contributions.
We also just had a question, and maybe we can review one part of it and then leave the next part of it to when we're in the scenario planning. But it's just it's a question around one-time expenses. So new car, home maintenance, or cash gifts to kids. So just to reiterate, what we normally would recommend is having that sinking fund for things like car replacements and home maintenance. So include that in the spending as we did before, 350 per month, 300 per month. We're saving up for those replacements as they come up. But once we're in the scenario, there is a way to add, I know in 3 years I'm going to replace my car. I know I have this kind of big one-time expense or gifts that we want to give the kids. And we'll review where that is as we go through the scenario if you'd like to do it more one-off. Is that fair, Owen? Anything to add there?
No, yeah, that's perfect. We can definitely highlight that, or later we can always send, there's a video example on the YouTube channel that goes through how to make specific scenario adjustments as well. Excellent. Okay, so let's dive into the chart. So let's talk a little bit about this base scenario that we have. Let's start here with spending, because this is really spending driven. Again, the platform is driven by spending. It is trying to aim for this $88,440 per year in after-tax spending all the way until age 80. At age 80, it's now going to be aiming for 66,960. So very spending driven. Again, you could have more phases of retirement spending. So we might want to have 3 phases where we have even higher spending in early retirement, maybe a bit lower in mid, and then much lower in late retirement. So lots of granular sort of options there in terms of planning out different phases of retirement spending. Now, pre-retirement, we can see the debt getting paid off here. So we've got debt payments that does go down in the final year of retirement before they retire. And so there is some extra savings in that final year, just adding a bit more to RSP TFSA. And we look at income. So we can see we've got their employment income here. We start to draw on assets at age 56, when Dave's 56, and overall fairly successful plan. So if we look at net worth, they're peaking at about 1.5 million. They're drawing that down a little bit faster until age 65 when CVP and old age security begin. So if we go back to income, we can see those income amounts phase in here at 65. And then it starts to decline a little bit less rapidly. And then at age 80, again, starts to decline a little bit less rapidly because they're not spending quite as much at that point. So CPP and old age security will make up a fairly high percentage of their target retirement spending once they get to age 80. Now, what's neat is that this assumes a straight line sort of investment return. So it's a constant rate of investment return, that 4.88%. It's a constant inflation rate, the 2.1%. And it makes a nice, pretty graph, but it's not super realistic. And that's really what success rate is all about. So success rate, this is the sequence of returns risk. This is the, sort of stress testing of the plan, the decumulation plan. We sometimes refer to this as the spaghetti chart because there's just so many lines, you can't follow any specific line. And that's not really the intention. The intention here is that every line here represents one path that the retirement plan could take. So it represents one historical period of stock returns, bond returns, and inflation rates. And depending on the sequence of investment returns, and when I say investment returns, I'm referring to stock bond returns and also inflation rates. Depending on the sequence of investment returns, you could find yourself in these lower scenarios where there's a risk of running out of money quite early, or you could find yourself in these upper scenarios where you may never run out of money no matter how much you spend. So, there's a large kind of variability here. And that's what we want to highlight in this chart is that it's hard to kind of imagine all the different possibilities. And this is giving us a bit of a taste of what that could look like based on that spending assumption. Now, it's also interesting to highlight that when we look at net worth versus income, so they've got 1.5 million in net worth. When we look at their income in the different phases, they are drawing 90,000, across all of their income sources. When they switch to mostly registered withdrawals, it goes up to 104, 105,000. And so in early retirement, on their 1.5 million, they're actually drawing 6% out of their total financial assets. So this is well above that typical 4% rule that we often see. And the reason is we've got different income sources phasing in over time. So here we're starting at a 6% withdrawal. We're going up pretty close to 7% withdrawal here. But then that goes down quite significantly at age 65, 66 when CPP and OAS fully phase in. So, and then it drops again at age 80 when income spending assumptions go down. So here, this is one of the complexities of sequence of returns risk is that in the first 10 years of retirement, we've got a withdrawal rate that's quite aggressive, 6 to 7%. That drops fairly significantly after we get to age 65, 66, when CPP and old age security phase in, and then drops even further at age 80 when spending gets reduced. What's great about this dynamic success rate analysis is that it is taking into account all of those different phases of drawdown. So it's got the higher drawdown, the even higher in mid-retirement when we have just the registered withdrawals, higher tax bill. At 65, it's starting to decline on the withdrawal amounts. So you could see it's a little bit more of aggressive drawdown, then it's not quite as much. And then at age 80, it slows down again. The great thing about this analysis is it's taking into account all of those different phases of decumulation. It's not just a steady 4% all the way across. Now, let's talk about percentiles because we've had that question before. So the 10th and the 90th percentile, the reason why those are in the chart is because this is based on historical returns. We can have some fairly extreme levels of returns, both positive and negative. So on the negative return side, these are things like the Great Depression, high inflation of the 1970s. You can get some fairly extreme negative returns here, and we don't want to focus on the very, very worst case scenarios. So the 10% line is really to help us kind of, give us a little bit of a narrower guardrail to look at. We don't want to focus on this 67 potential for running out of money because that represents the most extreme, sort of period from the last 120 years or so. Now, same on the positive side. So, here you can see we have 3.5 million in this one scenario here. It would be unrealistic to focus on that one specifically. So the 90th percent line looks at the essentially ignoring the top 10% of cases. It's just looking at the top 90th percent line. So again, it's sort of helping us ignore the extreme outliers and focus just on the 90 and 10. And then the 50% line sort of mimics what we might expect here from the typical drawdown, straight line drawdown. Of course, it's not quite the same because there is a bit of variability from year to year. So again, if we have a down year in the first couple of years of retirement, those bigger withdrawals have a much bigger impact. And really, that's what we mean by sequence of returns risk is that if we start with 1.5 million and the first year of retirement, we're down to $1 million, a 33 or so percent decline. Super realistic. I mean, that's definitely within the realm of normal for a 75-25 portfolio. What that means is that we're now drawing a much larger percentage of the portfolio, and there's a much higher risk here in early retirement. If we were to have the other experience, if we were to go from 1.5 million up to 1.75, we're sort of de-risking the plan a little bit. So we'll talk a little bit about updating the plan towards the end of the session. Part of the reason we want to update the plan is because depending on which path we're on, we either need to make adjustments to spending if we're in the lower paths, or we could potentially increase spending if we're in the upper paths. So every year we want to dynamically change the plan depending on which one of these, 120 plus paths we're actually on. Anything I'm missing there, Chris?
Yeah, can you speak to, and I'm sorry if I missed this, but I don't believe so because this question just came up, was the difference between the success rate chart and a Monte Carlo analysis?
Yes, great question. So we do something that is called aft casting. So it's using actual historical returns. So it's using global US, Canadian equity returns, Canadian bond returns, fixed income returns, and Canadian inflation rates. And the reason why we like aft casting using historical returns is it's a little bit more relatable. So, these lines are like the Great Depression, the lower lines, high inflation of the 70s, the upper lines, like the 1990s, where you're getting 20% plus returns towards the end of the 90s there. So I like it because it's a bit more relatable. Sometimes the challenge with Monte Carlo analysis is that you can get some extreme outliers. So Monte Carlo is more of a statistical model. You put in your kind of median, standard deviation, and it will give you a range of possible outcomes, which are perhaps statistically possible, but maybe not likely. So for instance, Monte Carlo could give you a Great Depression happening back to back, possible perhaps, but not super likely. So that's why we tend to not use Monte Carlo. We tend to use aft casting is because it lends a little bit more of a kind of realism to some of the numbers. Now, as long as you're using the same parameters for your Monte Carlo based on historical sort of standard deviation that we've seen in the past, you should provide you with fairly similar results. But this is along the lines of what we've seen in history. So one thing to highlight is that if we end up seeing something worse than what's happened in the past, so if we have something worse than the Great Depression, worse than the high inflation rates of the 70s, early 80s, then we definitely want to adjust accordingly. But at least we've got that sort of benchmark in mind, right? So here, as long as we're not hitting things like the Great Depression and early retirement, then we're probably going to be okay. If we hit something like the 1990s again, probably a chance to spend more money. So I like aft casting. I find it a little bit more relatable in terms of like, okay, what's happened in the past and what do these lines actually represent?
Yeah, me too. And then just to kind of expand on that, so what does that success rate percentage mean in that light? So if I have 51% or 90%, what is what is that number? Obviously 90 feels better than 51, I guess. So like what am I taking from that number?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so it's important to highlight that success rate, the number here, I wouldn't focus too much on the number. Even plus minus 5% is essentially the same result, right? Because some of these lower lines are very close to zero, but might not be zero. So might be considered a success. However, if we only have a couple dollars left, is that really a success? That might be stressful to some people. So this success rate I would take with a grain of salt. I would adjust it to your personal risk tolerance and situation. If you're fairly conservative, you might be aiming for a higher success rate. If you're a little bit more aggressive, you might be aiming for a lower success rate. If you have some more variability in your spending, you might be aiming for a higher or lower success rate because you have more room to adjust. We're going to take a look at a couple of examples of how maybe to frame up those decisions using that success rate number. But I was also just look at the general trend of the lines here. So, even though it's 51% success rate, you know, in this 50% sort of situation, we're still going from 1.5 million down to, 500,000 or so within about 20 years. So some people might not find that comfortable, even though technically that's going to be successful, because they're reducing spending at age 80, that might be okay mathematically, but it might not feel great. So again, yeah, treat this with a grain of salt, adjust it for your personal risk tolerance, and definitely just get a sense. We'll kind of walk through some examples here of how to think about that.
Yeah, I think we're gonna add some more nuance to that question as you go. So please feel free to ask that question again later on. And I think this does go well into the second part, which is when we're looking at that chart, let's say we start with a 90% probability of success, and then all of a sudden things change. Life happens, we have bad series of returns, it drops to 40 or 50. At what point are we adjusting spending? Again, there's nuance to that, but I think it's a good thing to speak to.
Yeah, I think it's something that we want to get a feel for which one of these paths we're on. So again, here, if we see the extreme kind of a scenario, we're losing about a third of the portfolio in the first year of retirement. That would be the worst kind of situation. But mostly it's kind of the worst would be maybe losing 250,000 or so. So I like using this as a gauge to say, oh, look, the portfolio has dropped by $100,000. Yeah, that feels like a lot, especially in the first year of retirement, but definitely when we look at the chart here, well within the realm of normal. So below 50, not great, but definitely within the realm of normal. You could look at it the other way. You could also say, my portfolio has gone up 100 grand. We've had great investment returns in the last year. Can I spend another 20 grand a year? Probably not. So we might want to, again, treat that with a grain of salt because we're not in the extreme. We're still within that realm of, 10 to 90%. Now we'll talk about guardrails and retirement spending. But yeah, certainly use this as a gauge to see which path you're on. Are you within close to that 50% line, or are you perhaps way below or way above? that might give some indication of how you can maybe adjust spending in the future.
Right. Let's dive into the case study. And I think I'm going to keep getting to some of the questions that people have asked as we start to address them. So I'm not ignoring you, but I think that some of those things will be a little bit clearer as we're kind of looking through Dave and Bonnie's information.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start off the case study. Let's start off by looking at how we might optimize this plan. So let's make a copy of this first, and we'll just use some of the AI strategies to explore this. So call this the example. And Dave and Bonnie, so they're ending with an estate value of 981,000. We just want to explore if there's any other options. As I had mentioned, there is an option here, and it is coming up first, is that they want to the platform is suggesting, the AI strategies are suggesting that changing the accumulation order to registered first might be a good idea. So it does add about $30,000 in estate value. It does make sense also when you look at their marginal tax rate. So here, Dave's marginal tax rate, 30% before retirement, not extremely high. So you can understand why Dave and Bonnie were maybe prioritizing a TFSA tax-free savings account. But if we look in retirement, their tax rate's quite low, 20%. So anything that we can put into that RSP is already giving us close to a 10% differential between when they're employed, those last years of employment, and when they're first retired. So let's enable that one already, because that gets us an extra 3% total estate value. And we're not going to focus on CPP. So it is suggesting maybe delaying CPP benefits. We're going to maybe ignore that for now. Maybe there's some health concerns. Maybe there's a reason why we don't want to delay those benefits. So other than that, the next one is decumulation order. So here it's interesting. It is suggesting that we push out some of these registered withdrawals a little bit. We do have them converting to an RSP to a RIF early on. So they do have some minimum withdrawals, which gets mixed with the non-registered income. Here it's saying we should maybe change that again. So here it's going to mix withdrawals for us again, so some TFSA withdrawals. So generally, it seems like it's just keeping very low tax in early retirement and delaying some of that other taxable income until later. So likely sort of saying, if we can pay $6,000 in tax later, that's probably better. It leaves that money free to grow within the registered accounts. Also spreads out those withdrawals a little bit more. So anyway, interesting kind of insight there. So let's do this. We're up from 51 to 56%, but we're not quite where Dave and Bonnie want to be. So let's look at some options here where we might increase the success rate of their plan. And this is where we start exploring. So we want to understand how can we increase that success rate to be more than 56%, something a little bit more comfortable. Now, one of the first thing that gets popped out by the AI strategies is that we could reduce spending. That's the easiest lever to increase the success rate of the plan. And this is kind of back to that Chris point you were making just a moment ago, is like, how do you adjust spending? When do you know it's enough? What sort of adjustment is enough? Here it's already telling us, that adjusting spending down by 12,000 a year gets them to an 89% success rate. So yes, there are some historical periods that might be, worse, that might require an additional reduction in spending, but even going down to 18,000 gets us to 100%. So let's just start with this. Let's say it's a $12,000 reduction, and immediately we're up to an 89% success rate. So we're cutting into a little bit of maybe vacation, extra, sort of entertainment expenses, but still a healthy 76,000 a year. And then late retirement, we're at about 55,000. But now there's lots of room. We can see that this is a very successful plan, very high success rate. And other than the most extreme scenarios, and even then it's sort of happening here in their late 80s, early 90s, they're doing okay. So Dave and Bonnie might treat this as, this is the stable version of the plan. This is a good kind of base case to start with. Now, maybe for them, spending's not an option. So they say, you know what, I got to have the travel spending, got the pet spending, that's can't change that. Fair enough. So let's take a look at other options. Just how can we increase that success rate a little bit? So let's deactivate the spending, get back to that 56% success rate. So what other options do we have? Well, we could add a bit more employment income. So that's the other thing we can take a look at here. Now, it's not within the AI strategies, although it will be soon. We'll be looking at dynamically adjusting retirement age. So stay tuned for that. But here we can manually make an assumption. So let's assume maybe 1 extra year of income to start. Let's say it's up till age 56 for Dave. And so we've got 1 extra year of income. And then we're going to do the same thing for Bonnie. So Bonnie's got a bonus. So we're going to inflate both of those by a year. Clear that one. We'll do the same thing to the bonus here. And we'll just see what that does. That's going to give us a bit of a starting point. We just want to see whether or not that makes sense to increase the success rate. Let's go back over here, 56%. Not bad, 71. So we're getting closer. We're not at that same 89% that we were looking at with the spending reduction. So here we're keeping the same spending level, but we're adding a bit more savings in that first year that we otherwise would have been retired. Let's go a little bit further. Let's maybe add an extra year or two. So here, instead of 55, let's go to 57. And here, we'll do the same thing with the bonus. And let's do the same thing for Dave as well. So they're adding 3 more years. Let's go to 58. And what we want to adjust by inflation, cost of living adjustments. So 84. So we're getting pretty close there. You can see it's kind of diminishing returns. So 84% success rate. And again, now we're getting to the same sort of pattern on net worth. So if spending wasn't an option, then definitely they could look at other things like increasing their income for a few extra years. But if they're flexible, maybe that spending option is better to get 3 extra years of retirement. Anything else here we should highlight, Chris?
No, I don't think so on this side.
Okay. So that's sort of the different options for highlighting how we can change the success rate. But now we want to maybe look at, how do we create some guardrails for the retirement plan? So maybe they're comfortable with a 50% or so success rate. So let's clear these. And we're going to clear the overrides for Bonnie as well. And so maybe they kind of come back and say, you know what? I'd rather not work 3 extra years. I'm going to find a way to be flexible with spending. Perfect. So we can create some guardrails for them. So again, we want to, sort of understand, depending on the path that they're on, what sort of changes in retirement spending would we need to ensure 80, 90, 100% success? And again, the AI strategies will do that for us. So here, reducing spending, we already know that reducing by 12 to 18,000 a year will get us to 100% success rate. So Dave and Bonnie want to know, what does it take to get to 100%? It's going to require a reduction of 18,000 a year, which means spending of about 70,000 in early retirement. And this is the extreme. So here we're at 100% success rate, but even the 10th percentile is still at $500,000. So again, this is why we don't want to necessarily focus on 100% success rate. That would be extremely conservative, especially if you have room to adjust your spending in retirement. So we might want to choose something a little bit less, could be a $12,000 reduction. But for Dave and Bonnie, that gives them a great lower guardrail. They know that if they spend 70,000 a year in early retirement, even in the worst situations, like worst historical situations, they're still okay. They can still stay in their home. They're not forced to sell. They're not forced to move or downsize. They can stay in their home until late in retirement and be just fine. They don't have to drop their spending to 60 grand a year or 65 or anything lower, which sometimes might be the result. If you don't have those guardrails, you might go to the extreme. So we know for Dave and Bonnie, that's not necessarily what they have to do. They've got CBP, old age security, and a bunch of other income sources. Now, what about the other direction? What if we want to spend more? So let's take this off. Let's get back to our original success rate. So here we've got 56%. There's a little bit of room there. So what can we do to increase spending? Well, let's focus on the AI strategies. We could maybe increase it by about 3,000 a year. So Dave and Bonnie don't have a great success rate to start with, but they might have an upper guardrail, which is 3,000 to 6,000 a year higher than the, what are they spending today? 88,000. So let's say they want to go to the extreme. They want to look at, okay, what's the best case scenario for retirement? Again, it's not adding 20,000 a year because that's going to surely run out of money. It's more in that kind of 94, 95,000 a year. That will probably mean, on average, that they're going to tap into home equity at some point. But it does give us a fairly good success rate here. So that's a one way to sort of explore the different guardrails. If they don't want to be that aggressive, then we could always look at something a little bit less. So let's go back here, recalculate. So let's say they don't feel comfortable running out of money late in retirement. Let's go instead to spending. And let's say we increase it by 3,000. That's a 50% success rate. So it's a coin toss whether or not they run out of money in the future. So maybe if they get some bad sequence of returns in early retirement, they can't do that. But if they had a year like last year and this year, if they could lock in those good investment returns in the first year or two of your return to retirement, spending an extra 6,000 a year might be feasible. Anything to add on this one, Chris?
Yeah, I just think that to go back to those questions we had before, what you can do by doing this kind of playing around that Owen's doing is give yourself a retirement spending range. So $70,000, if you know you can live your life on $70,000, be reasonably happy, your spending is flexible. If the things are going badly, that's your floor, that's your safe space. If things go well, or if you really want to push it. So one of the questions that we have here, and I'd love for you to address it a little bit more, but it's this question of, what if I want my last check to bounce? We want to have zero money at the end. You might want to push on the more aggressive side. Now that's shifting as the years go. You still want to have enough money to last for a long and healthy retirement, but you might like the idea of pushing that. You might like a lower success rate, this more 50%, and to really take advantage of these early retirement years and have that look like. Any other tips if you really want that last check to bounce, zero money at the end of the plan?
I mean, everybody's different. Yeah, I like the idea. I think everybody has a different tolerance for, what that means. Maybe for Dave and Bonnie, that means that they're eating into all of their financial assets, but they want to keep their home. They want to pass that on. Maybe it's a family home, farm, whatever that is. And so maybe they want to pass that on in their estate. You might be comfortable tapping into that home equity. We often talk with clients and they say, well, you know what? I'm fine to take out a HELOC for 200, 300,000, convert to a reverse mortgage. That could allow you to be more aggressive with spending in early and mid retirement. I think the nice thing about success rate is that we can have a bit of a gauge of what it means to bounce that final check. So if you want to, if you're kind of in that first or second year of retirement, and again, if we're locking in some good investment returns, you can comfortably spend more knowing that you can then aim for that bouncing that last check. If you're in these lower lines, we probably want to be careful because again, we don't want to bounce that check at 73. That's going to put us into a very difficult position for the rest of retirement. So we want to use this as a gauge every year that we lock in a year of investment returns, whether good or bad. We are sort of deciding which path we're on here. So yeah, I would say it needs to be fairly variable. But as Chris pointed out, I love the idea of having that base level of spending, 70 grand a year, where we can say, Bonnie and Dave, you can spend that amount no matter what and be safe. And if you get some good or better than average investment returns, lower than average inflation rates, we can really push up that spending by quite a bit more, up to 94,000 a year, and quote unquote bounce that last check. So yeah, nice idea. Very difficult to execute in practice unless we're, tracking against these sort of different paths as you go forward.
And I think that something else that's come up in a couple of places here is we want to stay resilient to the potential of extra high costs in later retirement. So it's the fear of retirement home, long-term care costs. And the way we would see that on the platform and what we want to see there is we want to see some financial assets going into that late retirement to say, I have fallback assets. That's ideally what we would recommend a lot of the time when we're working with clients and kind of seeing on the platform. Now, if you're comfortable, again, like Owen was saying, it all depends on who you are. If you're comfortable tapping into home equity in order to fund that side, that can work for you. But other than that, you might want to be able to see more of a flat line on the net worth side. Anything else to add in terms of planning for nursing and retirement home?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you own a home or any sort of other real estate asset, cottage, vacation property, that does add another layer of protection. You can sell those assets in the future. It's always more difficult with renters, or if you plan on selling and renting in the future, because there just is a little bit more risk there. again, more reliant on investment returns, a little bit harder to tap into that portfolio if we have a bad sequence of returns in early or mid retirement. Yeah. Okay,
Can
great.
you talk a little bit about, so we've had a bunch of questions kind of around this idea, and it's all around updating. And I know that's
Yes.
something else we wanted to talk about. So just to kind of tell you a little bit the way people are coming into this. So it's kind of back to this original question of saying, okay, I'm on the 10% path. When do I adjust my spending to kind of stay on a better path? And also going through the practicalities of saying, how am I updating my information on the platform? So I'm dumping in the early next year. I want to add it where? What do updates look like? How often are we updating in order to stay on track for retirement spending?
Yeah. That's a good question. So let's say we are on those lower paths, right? So, we've started retirement with $1.5 million. First year, we're down to a million. Um, Maybe it's 1.25. Again, because Dave and Bonnie know that they can spend 70,000 a year almost regardless of investment returns. Of course, if something more extreme than what's happened in the past happens, then we want to adjust accordingly. But if it's somewhere on the scale of the Great Depression or something like the high inflation of the 70s, we know that dropping spending from 88,000 a year down to 70 is safe. So again, your own personal risk tolerance is going to drive a little bit of this, but we might say that if we're on that 10% line, if we're in some of those more extreme circumstances, we probably want to start going back to that safer level of spending just to avoid running out at 73. If we did nothing, what this tells us right here is that if we keep spending that 91,000 a year, um, pretty good chance that we're going to run out by 73. Now, maybe it all rebounds the next year. Definitely could happen. But if we stay on that lower line, then the path is sort of laid out for us. And then 73 is when we'll be tapping into home equity. So these lower lines will often say that you want to then start to look at your lower spending guardrail as the default level. So the nice thing is having that at 70,000, we know that we don't have to go lower. We don't have to go to the extreme and spend 60 grand or 65. We can keep a fairly healthy, retirement budget still, but we do want to be a bit more prudent. Now, on the flip side, if we go up by 100 grand, we can maybe add a little bit of spending, but Dave and Bonnie have a long retirement period. So let's go to an example here of the update. So let's say that 3 months from now, Dave and Bonnie want to update their plan because they've gotten an inheritance of some sort. So we could maybe model this out as having an additional, taxable investment balance here. We've increased the account balance. They're now starting with, instead of 1.5 million, it's closer to 1.7. So here, we want to update the plan. And with their level of spending at 88,000, now instead of a 56% success rate, they're at 72. So now we can be more aggressive with spending. So we might come down here and say, well, let's maybe maximize spending. We can now go up pretty safely by 6,000 a year instead of 3 because of that extra 100,000 plus in inheritance that we received. And maybe it's not inheritance, maybe it's we've had a good investment year. Maybe come January, we're updating the plan and we look at our 2024 results and we say, you know what, that's way better than what we had anticipated. We've de-risked the plan by a year. We've locked in some good investment returns. Inflation rates are below or what we expected. We're now in one of those upper lines. Maybe we can update that spending to be, instead of plus 3,000, we can be plus 6,000. And so we can then activate that and say, okay, well, now we're back down to our 56 or so percent success rate. So every year we still need to adjust. We might decrease that spending from 94 to something less if we end up back on one of these lower paths. But yeah, as you lock in investment returns, as you get windfalls, inheritance, something like that, you can update the plan, rerun the success rate, and we're also dealing with a shorter period here now as well. So that also helps the success rate, the sequence of returns risk, because again, we're de-risking the plan. Every year in retirement, we're de-risking the plan by 1 year, as long as we get some good or average investment returns. Does that probably address the question, Chris?
I will let them come back at us if it doesn't.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the practicalities of somebody asked about if they want to update it next year? Are they refilling out the discovery section? What does that look like?
Okay, yeah, good question. So we will send out an email to everybody as we approach the end of the year. The platform will roll over automatically to 2025 when you rerun the projections as of January 1st, 2nd. So what you want to do is if you need to take 2024 numbers out, take that out before we get to the end of the year. The platform will automatically pull in Discovery and start a new projection as of 2025. We typically update all of the tax and benefit rates either on January 2nd or January 3rd. We try to do it right on the first, second day of the year with all of the new standard rates across the provinces and federally. So expect all of that to be updated within the first 1 to 2 days of the new year. And what you want to do is you want to update the discovery phase. So, obviously income might change. You might have a cost of living adjustment. You might have some increases in income. You might also have some changes in expenses, not just in total expenses, but you might also be, looking at your spending categories and say, well, you know what? I am actually spending a bit more on vehicle replacements or, maybe more commonly some of these personal items. You might want to adjust what those expectations are. You might also adjust retirement expectations. We often talk to clients who say, well, after I've thought about it a bit, I want to spend a bit more here, a bit less there. I want to see if I can get another 5 grand a year out of retirement and early retirement. I want to add another spending phase, have early, mid, and late. Your thinking about this might change as you kind of go through this exercise again and again. So definitely update this. Assets for sure. We want to always have beginning of the year balances. Hopefully we have a year like 2024 where we see these balances go up. So we might have 250 here instead of 220. We might have 440 instead of 420 or whatever we would have otherwise predicted. So again, updating these account balances, kind of locking in that good year. We know it can go down. Obviously, it can go up and down, but if we're locking in that year, we want to update those balances. Debt's the same. If you have debt, we want to update the new debt balance, payments if that's changed, interest rates, etc. And then tax and benefits. So if there's a change here, either with how much you can contribute, or for instance with CPP contributions, maybe there was a year you took some time off. Maybe you don't have a full year of pensionable earnings. So maybe adding that in there as well makes sense. But if you've already done a good job at the first kind of round through discovery, updating for the new year is as simple as saying, okay, my income's changed. I need to tweak some of my expenses. I've got my new account balances. And then you can start rerunning the projections to see how they might have changed, hopefully for the better with good investment returns.
Great. We have one more question here. And this is about the success rate chart. So specifically talking about, does changing asset allocation, equity, fixed income, percentages, 10%, 9%, does that affect the spaghetti success lines to kind of move up and around? Like, will changing your asset allocation affect the chart?
Yes, 100%. So some of the things that go into the chart. So obviously asset allocation will be important. It will dynamically change year by year. So if you are adjusting your asset allocation down here in the table, so for instance, Dave and Bonnie, they're not doing this. They're just having the same asset allocation all the way through 75-25. But let's say they want to enter retirement, they want to be a bit more conservative, 60-40. The platform will do a weighted average across the accounts. So if you have an RSP with a more aggressive or a TFSA, for instance, if you want to maximize the value of your TFSA in late retirement, it will do a weighted average based on the account balance so that year by year, when it's doing the success rate variability, it's taking that into account. Now, the other thing it's taking into account is the investment fees. So obviously, when we're doing investment returns and we're looking at historical investment returns, if you have 2%, 3% fees, you're not going to have the same success rate as somebody with 0.25% fees or less. So that does get taken into account as well as what are the investment fees you're paying. We're taking those historical returns, discounting it by the fees that you're paying, and then we're doing the analysis based on your weighted asset allocation year by year.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We're at the end of our hour already. Great questions, and I really appreciate Owen walking us through all those things. Thank you so much, Owen. If you have more questions, I'm going to just drop in our Reddit forum our Reddit forum, as well as our advice help center. So I've linked a few help articles in the chat, and I will link more. Sorry, my links did not work properly there. So I'm just going to drop the Reddit link there and the help doc link as well. And if you have more questions, please post them there. Please join us for our next office hours. This is going to be early next month. And our next case study is actually going to be based on the survivor scenarios module that have just been launched. So I hope you've had a chance to play around with that. If you haven't, it's very, very cool. We can test different life expectancies. There's all kinds of functionality with insurance, CPP survivor benefit, lots of things. So we'll be diving into that next month to really kind of give you a sense of all the cool things that it can do. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for using advice. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.